Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting installment of the Daily Elastic Bytes, this season focused on OpenTelemetry with Elastic. I am Carly Richmond. I am one of the developer advocates at Elastic, and today I'm going to be focusing on web tracing, particularly focusing on front end as my happy place. So we'll talk about when to use the OpenTelemetry web tracing, what the status is with regards to certain things that are of interest to front-end engineers, and we'll also talk about real user monitoring agents and when to use those as well. If you haven't checked out the other episodes within the series, I recommend you go back, particularly focusing on the episodes for custom spans that we focused on in JavaScript with Justin. So we're still going to be using the same OpenTelemetry demo. I've got it up running here. We've got sample traffic coming through via the load generation. And I've also enabled a couple of flags just to make sure that we've got some image slowness in here, which would be the types of things that would be interested in front end. Slow requests, slow loading of particular resources, and show how you can detect those using OpenTelemetry in Elastic. So for example, if I go and just trigger a reset of the page, what you'll see is that my product URLs are starting to come in a little bit slower than we would like. And this would be an example of something that I, as a front-end engineer, would want to dig into. So when it comes to doing tracing for front end specifically on the web, what we're going to be using is the web tracing SDK. As you can see, the load's on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new resource, as you can see from these lines here. It's obviously set to an environment variable, but what you need to know is its front end web is going to be the resource I'm going to create. I'm also detecting the browser resources, obviously an important consideration when building web applications, irrespective of whether you're dealing with the front end or the back end, is quite often you want to know what browser and user agent is being used by a user. It might lead to particular errors. All browsers have slightly different implementations for particular things. So in order to get this useful metadata, using the browser detector is the way to go. And in fact, if I go back in again, and if I go through to a simple post request in here, what you'll see is that in the metadata, I will in fact have this information. So if I look for agent, you'll see I've got the user agent configuration of headless Chrome, which does make sense because obviously Locust is sending traffic our way through that mechanism. Okay, so we do things that are very similar to what you've seen Justin do before. We're adding our own span processors. In this instance, I'm actually adding a span, adding the session ID using my own custom span processor. So it's just adding that as an additional attribute. And again, going back into the metadata, if we look for that, you'll see the session ID is populated. And this could be useful, for example, if you're debugging the session of one particular customer or one particular user that's seeing a very niche issue. You can then trace through the appropriate calls using an attribute such as session ID. Now in the front end, that gives us very basic tracing. So I can see here the latency and throughput. I can see document loading, which is coming through the default instrumentation. And within there, in fact, I can see the fetching of individual resources. So if I pick this one here and scroll down, I can see exactly what resource it is through the URL. I can see that actually that's the amount of time it's taking to load that image. And perhaps I might want to do some optimizations there in order to get a zippier response time if it's taking too long. We also might want to deal with measures. Now, because this is a Next.js application, we probably would want to utilize the routing layers in order to do simple counters. So for the example here, I'm using the simple get meter to get the front end from the OpenTelemetry API. And then what we're doing is we're creating a counter, very simple measure that's basically useful for summing things up. And that's going to count the number of front-end requests we have through the Next.js API routes. So what you'll see in my appropriate loop running with span is that the request counter we will increment in the finally block, so irrespective of whether it's successful or not. And I'll be able to see this in Elastic. So I've got a very simple lens visualization here. You can see things are ticking along. And I can see the average value of my front-end requests coming through as well, which is a useful metric. Now, when it comes to front-end, there's actually some industry standard metrics that we tend to look at, and that would be things like core web vitals and page load statistics. And what the situation is with regards to OpenTelemetry is actually it's under development at the moment. So that's not great if you're wanting to try and utilize this stuff in production. So if you are wanting to get a hold of things like Core Web Vitals against real live user traffic and not just a synthetic response through something like Lighthouse, you're going to need to crack out the RUM. And in that instance, what I'm talking about is Real User Monitoring Agent, which is a simple JavaScript agent that you install within your application, and that allows you to capture these types of information. So when it comes to installing it in the front end, you've got two options. You can either use a script tag, as you can see from this example here, or alternatively, which what I would do, particularly if I'm using a framework like React or Angular or something else, I would do a package install and configure the agent thusly, specifying a service name. So front-end web would be the name of the resource in OTel. So we probably set the service name here as something similar. The URL of the APM server in Elastic in our cluster that we want to send to. And optionally, you can also set the version and the environment, which can be useful if you're trying to track differences across perhaps production and non-production environments, or even across different application versions as well. If you're using particular frameworks, I recommend having a look to see if there's a framework extension available. There are some available for React, Angular, and Vue, and that allows you to hook into some of the framework-specific nuances. So for React, that would be routing. So here's an example here that I have up showing how you would utilize the APM routes component to wrap your routes for React Router DOM. Angular would be another good example. You would use the provider to hook into the error events, because in our frameworks, we handle these types of activities in very different ways. Other things you've got to watch out for, cross-origin requests. It's very likely that you're probably going to be making them against hosted services somewhere, maybe serverless functions in some regards. And that means when you need to access those, you need to make sure that we handle cross-origin requests. If you don't, you're going to wonder why things are going to get blocked. And indeed, if you look at the OpenTelemetry example, if you don't have the proxy cores configured correctly in that demo, you will find that the proxy might indeed block your RUM traffic. So make sure you've got cores configured correctly as per the docs, and that will then give you access to the user experience view, which has Core Web Vitals, it has the page load statistics, and we can track these on the real traffic alongside useful things such as the page load distribution across the world, which might be important if you have a global application. It's useful to know if there's areas in the world where page load time is longer. And also that visitor breakdown as well. What type of browsers and applications are being used? Can I correlate those against particular errors? So that's it. That's how we do front-end tracing, either with OpenTelemetry and the web tracing SDK, and also with RUM. We've talked about when to use one and when to use the other. And we'll be talking about all sorts of other OTel related content in the future episodes of this series of the Bytes. So please do check out all of the Bytes coming, and also check out the YouTube for more content as well. And I'll catch you all next time.